For almost all of human history, sleep had no furniture, no mattress, no frame, no private room waiting in the dark. When night arrived, the human body simply met the ground. Earth, sand, grass, animal skins, or bare soil became the surface where life paused until morning. The bed, the place many people now consider essential to sleep, is actually one of the newest environments the human body has ever known. Our species evolved, migrated, and survived ice ages without it. So how did a creature shaped by the ground come to depend on something raised above it? And why did 90% of human history sleep without a bed? It is easy, from inside the modern world, to think of a bed as something close to natural. A day ends, a room grows quiet, and somewhere in that room there is already a raised surface prepared for sleep. It waits with a kind of silence that feels older than history. But that feeling is misleading. The bed, at least in the form most people imagine it now, is not one of the ancient conditions of human life. It is a late arrangement built out of settled houses, stored materials, craft traditions, and private space. For most of the long human story, sleep did not rise above the earth. It stayed close to it. That does not mean prehistoric people slept carelessly, or that they knew no comfort, or that rest was always miserable. It means something simpler and more important. The human body learned to sleep long before furniture became part of ordinary life. Long before wooden frames, woven supports, stuffed mattresses, and separate bedrooms, there was only the problem of night, the need for safety, the need for warmth, the need to recover, and whatever surface the surrounding world could offer. In that older world, the ground was not the opposite of a bed. It was the original sleeping surface from which all later beds would slowly depart. This is the first idea we need to hold on to. Sleep is ancient. Beds are recent. The distance between those two facts is where the whole story begins. Our species did not begin in towns, behind doors, in permanent houses filled with objects. It began in shifting landscapes, in climates that changed, in shelters that were often temporary, in social groups that moved, paused, gathered, and moved again. Under those conditions, the question was not whether a person had a bed. The question was where a body could lie down without losing too much heat, without drifting too far from the group, and without meeting the night alone. Even much later, after some human communities built more stable dwellings, the existence of a true bed could not be assumed. A sleeping place and a bed are not the same thing. A sleeping place can be a prepared patch of ground, a layer of plant material, an animal hide, a mat, a platform, a hearthside surface, or a shared area inside a shelter. A bed is something narrower and more culturally specific. It usually implies construction, separation from the floor, repeated use, and often some idea of personal ownership. That distinction matters because once we confuse the two, the past begins to look too much like the present. Then we imagine that earlier humans were merely waiting for the invention of the bed, as if all history were moving toward the mattress. But history does not work that way. People adapt to what their environments allow, and they build habits around what is practical, available, and worth the effort. For a very long time, raising the body above the ground was not the central requirement of sleep. The central requirement was surviving the night and waking again. In that sense, the bed is not the beginning of human rest. It is one late answer to an older biological need. And once we see that clearly, a strange reversal appears. The unusual thing in human history is not sleeping on the ground. The unusual thing is expecting every night to end on a surface made just for one body. That expectation feels basic, only because it is familiar. Measured against the full length of human time, it is new enough to be almost recent. So before we ask when beds appeared, or who first slept above the earth, we have to begin with a quieter and less comfortable truth. For most humans who ever lived, night came first, the ground came next, and the bed never arrived at all. To understand why this matters, it helps to step away from the modern bedroom and look at human time on its true scale. The bed feels permanent only because our own lives are short. A person born today may spend nearly every night of life on some version of one. A crib, a mattress, a frame, a padded surface, a hospital bed, a bed in old age. Seen from within one lifetime, the bed seems to accompany the human body from beginning to end. But the life of our species is not measured in decades. It is measured across immense spans of movement, adaptation, and survival. Within that larger frame, the bed stops looking permanent and begins to look like a very thin layer laid over a much older reality. For most of the time anatomically modern humans have existed, there were no furnished bedrooms, no household expectation that each person would have a designated sleeping structure, and no universal object that can be cleanly compared to the modern bed. There were sleeping places, yes, sometimes carefully arranged, sometimes improved with available materials, but that is not the same thing. The distinction is easy to miss because modern life trains us to think of comfort as the natural destination of history. We imagine the past as incomplete and the present as finished. Yet the older human story is not a simple march towards softer surfaces. It is a story of bodies meeting the limits and possibilities of local environments. In one place, the ground may have been dry and forgiving. In another, it may have required layers of grasses, leaves, skins, or branches to make rest possible. In colder conditions, sleeping close to others and close to stored warmth may have mattered more than whether the body was lifted above the earth. In wetter places, a community might improvise barriers from dampness without creating anything like what we would now call a bed. The point is not that early humans ignored comfort. The point is that comfort had to be made from the ground upward, not assumed in advance as a manufactured object. This changes how we think about the body itself. The body that now sinks into mattresses was not formed in a world of mattresses. It was formed in a world where sleep had to coexist with uneven surfaces, shared warmth, exposure to seasonal change, and the practical demands of moving through landscapes that did not contain furniture. That does not mean the human body is meant to suffer, or that all modern sleeping arrangements are somehow unnatural in a simple sense. It means only that our baseline expectations are historically very young. We are living inside an environment of sleep that would have been unfamiliar to most humans who ever existed. Even the idea that sleep belongs in a separate room, on a personal structure, at a stable height above the floor, surrounded by quiet and property, depends on social arrangements that came very late. Agriculture, denser settlements, accumulated goods, more fixed houses, and eventually stronger divisions between public and private life, all helped create the conditions in which beds could become ordinary. Before that, the most basic fact of night was not ownership of a sleeping object, but negotiation with darkness, temperature, other bodies, shelter, and time. That is why the title is not really about furniture alone. It is about a lost baseline. It is about the fact that for most of human history, sleep happened in direct conversation with the earth. The surface beneath the body was part of the environment, not a product removed from it. Once that older baseline disappears from memory, the bed begins to feel timeless. But it is not timeless. It is historical, local, unevenly distributed, and deeply tied to the later development of settled human life. And when we remember that, a quiet but important reversal takes place. We stop asking why earlier humans lacked beds, as if they were missing something obvious, and we begin asking a different question instead. How recent must our world be? If one of its most ordinary objects would have been absent through almost all of human experience, if we follow that thought a little further, the bed begins to change meaning. It stops being a simple household object and becomes evidence of something larger. A bed suggests a world in which a sleeping place can remain in one location, night after night, because the people using it also remain there. It suggests stored materials, enough interior space to dedicate part of a shelter to rest, and a level of stability that much of earlier human life did not consistently possess. In this sense, a bed is not just a place to sleep. It is a sign of settlement, repetition, and control over the immediate environment. That is one reason it belongs to the later layers of the human story rather than the beginning. The oldest human condition was not a life built around objects waiting in place. It was a life built around bodies adapting to places that changed. This matters because it protects us from reading the past backwards. Once a thing becomes ordinary, we begin to imagine it as inevitable. We forget how many conditions had to gather before it could seem basic. A bed may look simple, but historically it depends on many other simplicities arriving first. Walls that last, floors that stay dry, materials that can be shaped and stored, sleeping areas not constantly remade by movement, and enough predictability in daily life that a specific structure can be reserved for rest. Remove those conditions, and the bed becomes less necessary, less practical, or simply impossible to maintain. The ground, by contrast, requires no construction to exist. It is always there. What changes is how humans negotiate with it. They can soften it, clear it, cover it, warm it, share it, or avoid the worst parts of it, but they do not need to invent it. That is why the ground belongs to the deepest layer of this story. It is not just where people sometimes slept before better solutions arrived. It is the original surface against which the human problem of sleep was first solved, again and again, across vastly different places and generations. This also helps explain why the phrase "without a bed" should not be heard as a phrase of pure deprivation. To modern ears, it sounds immediately like lack, poverty, or discomfort. Sometimes it surely was uncomfortable. Sometimes it was cold, hard, damp, crowded, unsafe, or interrupted. But not every absence in the past is best understood as failure. For much of human history, the absence of a bed did not represent falling below a standard. It represented living before that standard had even been created. Sleep still happened. Recovery still happened. Childhood, adulthood, injury, illness, birth, aging, and death all unfolded in a world where the body did not expect to be raised above the earth each night. That older world was not organized around the comforts many people now take for granted, but it was still a human world, one in which rest had to be woven into whatever form of life was materially possible. And that is the deeper shift this opening movement is trying to make. The question is not whether beds are useful. Of course they are. The question is what happens to our understanding of ourselves when we realize how little of human existence they actually cover. A species can come to treat something as essential even when that thing arrives very late. Once it is woven into everyday life, it begins to feel like a biological need rather than a historical arrangement. But history quietly resists that illusion. It reminds us that many of the conditions we call normal are not ancient at all. They are recent solutions resting on older bodies. So as we move forward, the important thing to carry with us is not a romantic image of prehistoric hardship, and not a rejection of modern comfort, but a more disciplined sense of proportion. The bed belongs to history, not to the beginning of the species. The ground came first, and it remained the ordinary sleeping surface for so long that the true surprise is not that most humans once slept without a bed. The true surprise is that we forgot how new the bed really is. Before there were bedrooms, there were only nighttime surfaces. That is where this story has to slow down and become more physical. If most humans did not sleep in beds, then what exactly did their bodies meet when day ended? Not one single surface, and not one single prehistoric routine. The human past was spread across grasslands, woodlands, river edges, rocky shelters, dry ground, wet ground, hot climates, cold climates, temporary camps, longer used camps, caves, overhangs, huts, and open-air resting places. So the first honest answer is variation. Early humans did not sleep on one universal material. They slept on whatever the local world allowed them to turn into a usable place of rest. Sometimes that may have been bare earth, sometimes a layer of grasses or leaves, sometimes animal skins, sometimes sandier ground, sometimes packed soil, sometimes a surface near a hearth, sometimes a place prepared quickly, and sometimes a place used often enough to show repeated human presence. The common point is not the exact material. The common point is that sleep happened through direct negotiation with the surrounding environment rather than through a standardized object. This matters because the modern bed hides the environment from the body. It lifts, cushions, insulates, and regularizes. It creates the feeling that sleep takes place on something separate from the world outside. But in most of human history, the sleeping body remained much closer to the conditions around it. Temperature traveled more directly through the ground and air. Dampness mattered. Slope mattered. Wind mattered. The nearness of other people mattered. A patch of earth was never just a patch of earth. It was part of a larger decision about exposure, warmth, safety, insects, shelter, smoke, and distance from the group. In that sense, a sleeping place was less like a possession and more like a temporary solution. Even when people improved it, they were improving an environmental surface, not stepping into a separate technological world of rest. This is where the title becomes more than an image. Without a bed does not simply mean hardship. It means that for most of human time, the body entered sleep while still inside the logic of the landscape. The ground was not background. It was active. It pressed back. It absorbed heat. It held moisture. It carried dust, ash, smells, and sometimes traces of repeated use. To lie down was to enter a relationship with all of that. That relationship could be managed, but rarely erased. And because human life began under those conditions, our species did not start with a clean border between shelter and world. That border became stronger much later. In the beginning, the body rested in places that were partly made and partly found. This is also why archaeologists must be careful. Soft sleeping materials often disappear. A mattress decays. A layer of plants disappears. A skin leaves little behind. So the ancient sleeping world is often visible only indirectly, through traces of occupation, prepared surfaces, hearths, plant remains in rare conditions, or repeated patterns in where human groups stayed. The absence of preserved bedding does not mean the absence of care. It means the materials of sleep were often ordinary, perishable, and close to the land itself. From the point of view of deep history, that is exactly what we should expect. A species that lived for immense stretches without furniture would have relied on surfaces that could be cleared, softened, layered, shared, and rebuilt from nearby materials. Not because people lacked imagination, but because local matter was what sleep had to work with. So when we ask what the human body first met at night, the answer is not a single object. It is the earth, modified when possible, endured when necessary, and understood through repeated bodily experience over generations. Long before the bed became a fixed human expectation, the night began with something simpler. A body lowering itself toward the ground, and trusting that this particular patch of the world would be enough until morning. A sleeping surface in deep human history was never just about softness. It was part of a larger decision about how to place vulnerable bodies inside a dangerous and changing world. A modern bed solves many problems before sleep even begins. It lifts the body away from cold floors, from dampness, from dirt, from some insects, from uneven pressure, and from the small discomforts of whatever lies beneath. But for most humans who ever lived, those problems could not be removed so completely. They had to be managed in place. That is why the sleeping ground was rarely neutral. A good place to lie down was also a place that reduced exposure. Dryness mattered because wet ground steals warmth. Some cover from wind mattered because the body loses heat even in rest. Proximity to others mattered because shared sleep could mean shared warmth, shared alertness, and less isolation in darkness. Nearness to a fire could matter too, though never in a simple or universal way, since warmth helped, but smoke, sparks, and shifting camp arrangements also shaped where people could realistically rest. In other words, the surface itself cannot be separated from the wider sleeping setting. The ground beneath the body was only one part of a whole arrangement of shelter, climate, materials, and social closeness. This is important because the phrase sleeping on the ground can sound too simple, almost primitive in a vague way, as if it describes a failure to improve conditions. But the deeper truth is more practical. The ground was often altered. It could be cleared of stones. It could be covered with grasses, leaves, branches, furs, mats, or whatever else the landscape provided. Ashes and hearth areas might affect where a place felt warmer or drier. Repeated use could slowly turn one patch into a familiar resting area. None of this turns the ground into a bed in the modern sense, but it does show that humans were not passive beneath the night. They adjusted the sleeping surface where they could, within the limits of what was mobile, available, and worth the labour. The key difference is that these adjustments usually remained close to the land rather than replacing it. A mattress in the modern sense creates a layer of distance between body and environment. Earlier sleeping surfaces often reduced discomfort, but they did not erase the environment. The body still remained part of it. This closeness may help explain why ancient sleep had to be more situational than standardized. A person did not simply lie down on the same manufactured surface no matter the season or region. The body had to learn, over long stretches of human experience, what kinds of places were tolerable, what kinds of coverings held warmth, what kinds of terrain should be avoided, and how much rest could be secured under imperfect conditions. That learning was not written in manuals. It was carried through practice, through camp habits, through shared life, and through repeated bodily memory. This is one of the most important differences between their world and ours. We inherit sleep now through objects. Earlier, humans inherited it much more through environments and group routines. And once we see that, another false image begins to fade. We no longer imagine that history before the bed was only hard ground and discomfort. Instead, we begin to see a long period in which human rest depended on modest but meaningful improvements made directly on the earth. The surface might still be rough by modern standards, but it was not always raw. It could be selected, modified, reused, and understood. That makes the old sleeping world less mysterious and more human. The body at night was not entering a blank wilderness each time. It was entering a place prepared just enough to make sleep possible, but not transformed enough to become separate from the world around it. For most of human history, that was the real condition of rest. Not sleeping nowhere, and not sleeping in a bed, but sleeping in a piece of the environment that had been made, for one night or many, just bearable enough for human life to continue. What the body first met at night was not comfort in the modern sense, but contact. Contact with temperature, with texture, with the slight unevenness of real ground, with whatever could be placed between skin and earth, and with the presence of other human bodies nearby. That last detail may be one of the most important. A modern bed often suggests separation. One person, one mattress, one private zone of rest. But much of the older human world was organized differently. Sleeping surfaces were shaped not only by landscape but by social life. The place where someone lay down was often also a place defined by nearness to others, kin, children, partners, elders, or the broader group. Warmth was not just in materials under the body, it was in proximity. Safety was not just in shelter, it was in shared presence. This does not mean every night was orderly or every camp was the same. It means that the first human sleeping surface was rarely only a physical surface. It was also a social surface, a shared area in which bodies rested together because survival itself was often collective. That is one more reason the bed came late. A true bed, especially a personal one, belongs to a world where sleeping space has become more individualized, more stable, and more materially separated from the rest of life. For much earlier humans, those boundaries were thinner. The body did not withdraw each night into a private structure built for one. It settled into a patch of ground that made sense within the group and within the conditions of that place. This is where the story becomes quietly revealing. We often think of sleep as a deeply personal act, but for most of human history, its setting was less private than we now assume. The ground gathered people into patterns of closeness dictated by warmth, shelter, danger, and habit. A sleeping place might be chosen because children needed to remain near adults, because vulnerable members of the group could not be left at the edge, because the available sheltered area was limited, or simply because resting together reduced the risks of the night. Even when coverings or padding were used, they existed inside that shared arrangement. They softened the earth, but they did not yet create a fully separate sleeping world for each individual. That distinction helps us understand why the bed is not just a softer surface. It is a reorganization of human rest. It creates distance from the floor, from dirt, from uneven terrain, and often from other bodies as well. That kind of separation only becomes common when houses, possessions, room divisions, and ideas of personal space become stronger than they were for most of the species past. Before that long transition, sleep remained closely tied to the physical and social conditions out of which it emerged. The body lay down where the group could protect it, where the environment could be managed, and where rest could occur without too much loss of heat or security. In that sense, the early sleeping surface was never just an object missing from history. It was part of a whole arrangement that made different sense from the one many people live in now. The ground was not merely what people had before they discovered beds. It was the ordinary basis of sleep in a world where mobility, shared living, and environmental limits shaped nearly everything. And once we accept that, the title stops sounding exaggerated. It becomes a proportion. Most human beings who ever fell asleep did so without the expectation of a raised sleeping structure waiting for them. They lay down in spaces made workable by effort, by knowledge of place, by whatever material could be gathered, and by the presence of others. The first sleeping world of our species was not built around furniture. It was built around contact with the earth and contact with one another. Only much later would those contacts begin to loosen, as sleeping surfaces slowly rose and the bed emerged as something that seemed, to future humans, impossible to do without. The next step is to separate two things that modern life has almost fused together: sleep and the bed. In everyday experience, they seem nearly identical. To say that someone is going to sleep often means they are going to bed. The language itself reveals the confusion. But biologically and historically, these are not the same event. Sleep is ancient, deep, and widespread across life. The bed is recent, local, and constructed. One belongs to the body, the other belongs to culture, materials, and changing forms of human settlement. If we fail to keep that difference clear, then the whole title becomes harder to understand. We start imagining that people long ago somehow lacked the proper setting for sleep, when in fact sleep itself existed long before any such setting was invented. The body did not wait for a bed before it could rest. It could not have. The need for sleep is older than our species, older than houses, older than tools, older than anything we would call civilization. A human being must sleep whether or not there is comfort, furniture, privacy, or protection. That is why the body's relationship to night began in a world without manufactured sleeping structures. It had no alternative. Rest had to occur under the conditions life could actually provide. In this sense, the history of sleep begins not with design, but with necessity. A body reaches its limit. Wakefulness can no longer continue. Attention weakens. Reaction slows. Recovery becomes unavoidable. At that point, whatever surface the world offers becomes the place where sleep must happen. A bed may improve that experience, organize it, soften it, and make it more predictable, but it does not create the need. It only answers it in a particular way. This is important because modern comfort can make older sleep seem incomplete, as if the bed were the final form toward which all rest was always moving. But the older human story does not support that view. For most of human history, sleep remained a biological act carried out in environments that had not yet been transformed into specialized sleeping worlds. The body still passed through fatigue, lowered itself into stillness, drifted into reduced awareness, and recovered enough to continue living. That process could happen on earth, on plant matter, on skins, on mats, near a hearth, inside a shelter, or in any place where the risks of night could be managed. None of those settings had to resemble a modern bed in order for sleep to remain real. That may sound obvious, but it changes the emotional center of the title. Without a bed is not the same as without sleep. It means that sleep itself is more fundamental than the structures later built around it. This is one of the clearest examples of how the body comes before the object. Furniture belongs to a phase of history when humans could shape their surroundings with greater permanence. Sleep belongs to the older condition in which the body had to negotiate with the world directly. So when we picture early humans resting, we should not imagine failed bedrooms. We should imagine living bodies doing what living bodies had always needed to do, but doing it without the later layers of insulation and arrangement that now feel normal. That distinction may be the central intellectual shift of this part of the story. Beds changed human sleep environments, but they did not invent sleep. They are one historical solution laid over a biological problem that had already been solved, imperfectly but repeatedly, for immense stretches of time. Long before anyone built a frame or stuffed a mattress, the human body already knew darkness, fatigue, recovery, and the strange surrender each night requires. In the deepest sense, sleep belongs to the species, the bed belongs to history. And once we separate those two, it becomes easier to understand how the first could be universal, while the second remained absent for most humans who ever lived. Because sleep comes before furniture, the body should be imagined first in terms of rhythm rather than objects. Long before there were crafted sleeping structures, there were already daily cycles of light and dark, activity and stillness, exposure and withdrawal. Human beings, like other animals, did not invent the basic need to alternate between waking life and restorative rest. What changed over time was not the existence of sleep itself, but the material setting in which it took place. This is a subtle difference, yet it matters deeply for the logic of the title. If sleep is biological and ancient, While the bed is cultural and recent, then the bed cannot be treated as the natural home of sleep. It is only one late environment in which sleep now often happens. The original home of sleep was wherever the body could safely become still enough to endure the loss of vigilance that night requires. That point is easy to underestimate in the present, because modern sleep usually takes place inside layers of protection. Doors close, walls hold, temperature can be controlled, soft surfaces reduce pressure. A person may sleep alone and still feel secure because the surrounding structure continues guarding the body while consciousness drops away. But for most of human history, reduced awareness was a more exposed condition. To sleep was to become less alert in a world that did not pause. That is one reason sleeping places mattered so much, even when there were no beds. The question was not how to achieve perfect comfort. The question was how to allow a body to enter a vulnerable state without too much danger. That could mean closeness to others, a favourable patch of ground, nearby warmth, shelter from wind, or a place already known through repeated use. In that older world, the sleeping environment was not separate from the biological act. It wrapped around it. The body's need for sleep had to be matched with just enough safety and just enough tolerable surface for rest to happen at all. This also helps explain why early human sleep should not be imagined as primitive in the careless sense. There is a difference between lacking furniture and lacking structure. Even without beds, human groups could have routines, preferred sleeping areas, habits of closeness, and practical ways of arranging the night. Sleep before furniture was not sleep before intelligence. It was sleep before one particular class of object became ordinary. The body still needed rhythm, still needed pauses in activity, still needed the repair and regulation that sleep supports. But it met those needs within environments that remain much closer to weather, ground conditions, and social arrangement than ours do now. That closeness is the real contrast. The modern bed makes sleep feel detached from landscape. Earlier, human sleep remained entangled with it. And because that was true for such a long portion of our history, it may be more accurate to say that the bed transformed the setting of human sleep, rather than fulfilling some long-delayed biological requirement. The requirement was already there, written into the body long before houses became stable enough to hold dedicated sleeping furniture. What changed was that later societies gradually built a more predictable place around that requirement. Once they did, the object became so familiar that language itself began to merge the two realities. People did not just sleep, they went to bed. That phrase makes historical sense only in a world where the bed has become normal enough to stand in for the act itself. Earlier humans could not have spoken that way, even if they knew well the need for rest, the comfort of familiar sleeping spots, and the practical importance of arranging the night. So when we continue asking why most of human history slept without a bed, we are really asking how a basic biological necessity was carried for so long without the object that now seems inseparable from it. The answer begins here. Sleep never depended on the bed in the first place. The bed arrived later and slowly wrapped itself around a much older need, until the newer thing began to look ancient and the older thing was almost forgotten. Once we separate sleep from the bed, another misunderstanding begins to fade. It becomes easier to see that the history of human rest is not a story of one invention suddenly making true sleep possible. It is a story of gradual layering. First, there is the body and its unavoidable need for recovery. Then there is the environment, which may or may not offer a place where that recovery can happen with some safety. Then there are small human adjustments, clearing a patch of ground, gathering plant material, arranging closeness, choosing shelter, returning to familiar spaces. Only much later do specialized objects begin to appear, and even then they do not replace the older logic all at once. They simply add more distance between the body and the world. That distance is what the bed ultimately provides. It lifts, softens, regularizes, and in many settings individualizes. But none of that should be mistaken for the origin of sleep. The origin lies much deeper, in the biological fact that a human being cannot remain awake indefinitely and must repeatedly surrender to a state of lowered awareness. That surrender had to be managed for hundreds of thousands of years before most humans could expect anything like a proper bed. This is why the older human sleeping world should be understood as skilled rather than unfinished. It was not waiting passively for furniture to complete it. It had already developed ways of making sleep possible under variable conditions. Those ways may have looked modest compared with a modern bedroom, but modest does not mean meaningless. A layer of dry grass, a protected corner of a shelter, shared warmth, repeated camp organization, even the simple knowledge of which ground stayed less damp through the night, these are not beds, yet they are part of the long human labor of protecting sleep. They show that people were always working on the problem, even when they solved it without separate sleeping structures. In that sense, the boundary between sleeping place and bed was crossed slowly, not suddenly. Humans first learned how to rest in the world, and only later learned how to build more of the resting world for themselves. That difference matters because it keeps the title honest. If we say that most of human history slept without a bed, we are not saying humans slept without care, or without adaptation, or without any effort to improve the night. We are saying that the improvements remained close to the ground for most of the species' existence. They did not yet become, for most people, a dedicated object lifted above the earth and reserved for sleep. This also explains why modern people can feel such deep attachment to beds without those beds being ancient. Once a late historical solution becomes woven into childhood, illness, intimacy, privacy, and daily routine, it no longer feels like a solution. It feels like a basic condition of being human. But history keeps a longer memory than habit does. It shows that the body carried sleep across immense stretches of time before most of the world ever encountered that object in a stable and familiar form. The bed belongs to an advanced layer of material life, but sleep belongs to the creature itself. The first is built, the second is inherited, and when those are confused, we begin to imagine that human rest has always needed what only recent societies could widely provide. The deeper truth is simpler and more humbling. The human body was already ancient in its need for rest when the bed was still nowhere in sight. It had already crossed continents, endured changing climates, and entered the night thousands upon thousands of times without rising above the ground. So by the time beds became ordinary for some people, sleep was already old beyond measure. The bed did not teach humans how to sleep. It entered the story after the body had been doing that work for almost all of its existence, and that is why the modern union of sleep and bed, though powerful, is still only a recent chapter in a much longer human past. The further back we go, the less direct the evidence becomes. That is especially true for sleep. A stone tool can survive for immense stretches of time. A hearth may leave burnt traces in soil. Bones, pigments, cut marks, post holes and broken ceramics can sometimes endure, but the materials most likely to shape an ancient sleeping place are often the very things least likely to remain. Grass decays, leaves collapse into the ground, animal skins disappear, mats rot, soft coverings vanish. Even a carefully prepared place to rest may leave behind only the faintest signal, or none that can be identified with confidence after enough time has passed. This is why any honest account of prehistoric sleep has to begin with restraint. Archaeology can show us many things about where humans lived, gathered, cooked, sheltered, and returned. It can sometimes suggest where people may have rested, but it does not usually hand us a perfect image of a sleeping night. It gives fragments, contexts, surfaces, traces of repeated occupation, and occasional hints of plant use or prepared areas. From those, careful researchers can infer possibilities. They cannot simply watch the past. This matters because the title could easily tempt a false kind of certainty. It would be simple but misleading to speak as if we could directly see most ancient humans lying on bare ground with no intermediary at all. Sometimes that may indeed have happened, but often the more responsible statement is narrower. For most of human history, there is no evidence that beds in the familiar modern sense were a normal part of life. While there are many reasons to think sleep happened on ground-level surfaces that may have been selected, shared, and sometimes modified with perishable materials, that sentence is less dramatic, but much closer to what the evidence allows. It protects us from turning the deep past into a stage set built for our own assumptions. Archaeology is strongest when it tells us what kind of world people inhabited, what materials were available, how shelters were used, how fire shaped living space, and how repeated occupation could organize surfaces within camps or caves. Those clues matter for sleep because a sleeping place is part of habitation. Where people rest is connected to warmth, crowding, smoke, safety, moisture, cleanliness, and the arrangement of social life. Yet even here, caution is necessary. A patch of plant remains is not automatically a bed. A cleared area is not automatically a bedroom. A platform, where one exists, is not automatically a mattress in any modern sense. The evidence must be read in proportion to what it actually shows. This carefulness is not a weakness. It is one of the reasons archaeology is so valuable. It resists fantasy. It reminds us that the most human parts of life are often the hardest to preserve. Sleeping, caring for children, lying beside others, settling down at the edge of exhaustion, these leave fewer durable signatures than cutting stone or shaping bone. So the silence of the archaeological record in some areas should not be mistaken for the absence of behaviour. It often reflects the fragility of the materials involved. In fact, that fragility fits the broader logic of this story. If most humans slept without built beds for most of history, then much of their sleeping world would have depended on local, ordinary, perishable things. Grasses gathered nearby, hides used and reused, earth cleared by hand, surfaces improved for a short time and then abandoned. Such practices would have been real enough in life and nearly invisible in deep time. That is exactly the kind of asymmetry archaeology often confronts. The durable survives, the intimate disappears. And so when we ask what archaeology can show about sleeping without beds, the answer is both substantial and limited. It can show that humans occupied spaces where ground-level rest made practical sense. It can sometimes show that surfaces were altered or organized. It can reveal environments in which a modern-style bed was absent or improbable. But it rarely lets us claim more than that with full confidence. The deeper lesson is not frustration. It is discipline. To understand how most of human history slept, we must learn to value evidence that is partial, careful, and quiet, because sleep itself, for most of our past, was lived in materials too soft to survive. That uncertainty in the evidence is not a barrier to understanding. It is part of the understanding itself. Once we accept that ancient sleep rarely preserves itself in direct form, we begin to look at the archaeological record differently. We stop asking for a perfect prehistoric bedroom and start asking a more realistic question. What kinds of spaces were humans repeatedly using, and what do those spaces suggest about where a body could rest? Sometimes the answer comes from caves or rock shelters where layers of occupation survive. Sometimes it comes from open-air sites where traces of hearths, tool use, discarded materials, and repeated habitation reveal that people did not merely pass through, but lived there long enough for the night to matter. In such places, sleep does not appear as a labelled feature. It appears as a necessity implied by everything else. If people ate there, worked there, cared for children there, and remained into darkness, then bodies must also have rested there. That sounds simple, but it is methodologically important. We know sleep had to happen. The question is not whether it existed, but what the sleeping surface may have been like under conditions we can only partly reconstruct. One useful clue is spatial organization. Human groups often do not scatter activities at random. Fires, working areas, discarded bones, tools, pigments, and repeated movement can create patterns. In some sites, researchers have found evidence suggesting that certain zones were cleaner, less used for heavy activity, or associated with plant materials that may have served multiple purposes, including flooring, insulation, or resting surfaces. Yet even in such cases, caution remains essential. A layer of vegetation may have been used for sitting, storage, working, covering, or sleeping, and sometimes for several of these at once. The archaeological record does not always separate functions neatly because real human life rarely did. The same ground could hold many roles across a single day. That is another reason the modern bed can mislead our imagination. It trains us to think of sleep as an activity assigned to a specialized object in a specialized room. Earlier human life often compressed many activities into shared spaces. Rest may have happened in places that were also used for conversation, care, food preparation, tool repair, or simple shelter from weather. The sleeping world was less isolated from the rest of life. Archaeology often reflects that overlap. Instead of finding a clear bed, we find a living surface. Instead of a bedroom, we find a habitation zone. Instead of a mattress, we find traces that suggest people tried to make certain areas more tolerable than others. That is enough to tell us something important. It tells us that sleep was integrated into environments that remained materially modest and close to the ground. It also tells us why claims about prehistoric beds must be made carefully. In a few later societies, evidence for raised sleeping platforms or formalized furniture becomes easier to identify. But across the much deeper span of human existence, the strongest pattern is not the widespread presence of beds. It is the widespread likelihood of ground-level sleep arrangements, sometimes improved, sometimes shared, and often archaeologically faint. The absence of durable beds in those vast earlier periods fits what we know about mobility, housing limits, material scarcity, and the perishability of most sleeping aids. This does not mean no one ever raised themselves above the ground in any way. It means that such solutions, where they existed, were not the stable and universal baseline of human life. The baseline was still the earth, slightly altered when possible, surrounded by the ordinary evidence of habitation rather than the clear outline of furniture. That is why archaeology, even when incomplete, still supports the larger logic of the title. It does not need to preserve every sleeping place in detail to show that the modern bed is historically unusual. Sometimes what matters most is not a dramatic discovery but a consistent absence combined with a plausible environment. Humans lived, repeated their lives, and left traces in places where ground-level sleep makes sense and specialized beds rarely appear. That pattern, quiet as it is, tells a deep story. It tells us that the first home of human rest was not a constructed object standing apart from the floor. It was the inhabited ground itself, shaped just enough by human hands to carry the body through another night. There is also a deeper lesson hidden inside what archaeology fails to preserve. The missing softness of the past tells us something about the past itself. Beds, mattresses, padded layers, and many other familiar elements of sleep survive poorly because they are made of the kinds of materials human beings most commonly used when they did not yet live among durable manufactured goods. Plant fibers, reeds, grasses, skins, bark, woven matter, and simple coverings belong to a world in which sleep was arranged through local materials rather than through long-lasting furniture. The fact that these materials vanish is frustrating for historians, but it is also historically meaningful. It reminds us that much of ordinary human life was built from things close at hand, things borrowed from the landscape and then returned to it. In that older world, the sleeping surface often belonged to the same cycle. It was made, used, worn down, remade, and forgotten. That is very different from the modern bed, which is expected to remain in one place, hold its form, and serve as a stable object across months or years. The archaeological silence around ancient sleep therefore does not just limit our knowledge, it reflects the underlying material reality of a species that spent most of its history resting without permanent sleeping furniture. This is why caution and imagination must work together, but only in the right order. First comes restraint. We should not claim detailed certainty where the evidence cannot support it. We cannot say exactly how every prehistoric group arranged the night. We cannot assume one surface, one custom, or one model of rest across enormous stretches of time and geography. Human sleep almost certainly varied with climate, shelter, group size, available materials, and local dangers. But once we accept that range, we are still left with a strong and consistent conclusion. For most of human history, sleep appears to have taken place on or very near ground-level surfaces, often modified in practical ways, but not organized around the widespread presence of what modern people would recognize as beds. That is a careful statement, and care is exactly what this subject demands. It is tempting to turn the past into a stark contrast. Modern softness against ancient hardness, private comfort against raw exposure. Yet the truth is more measured. Ancient sleep may often have been less insulated, less individualized, and less materially elaborate, but it was not necessarily shapeless. Human beings were always solving problems. They solved the problem of hunger with tools, the problem of cold with fire and coverings, the problem of movement with paths and memory, and the problem of sleep with the surfaces and shelters they could create from the world around them. Archaeology, even when fragmentary, shows enough of that problem-solving to keep us from making the past either too harsh or too familiar. It leaves us in a narrower but truer place. We can say that human groups prepared and occupied living surfaces. We can say that perishable materials likely played an important role, We can say that specialized beds were absent or rare through much of the deepest past. And we can say that the body, throughout all of this, continued to do what bodies do: grow tired, lie down, and depend on the surrounding world for enough support to cross the dark hours. That may be the most important point to carry forward from the archaeological record. The evidence is incomplete, but the pattern is not random. It keeps pointing back toward a long era in which sleep remained close to the earth, close to local materials, and close to the larger conditions of habitation. Beds, where they eventually appear more clearly, belong to a later stage in that story. They are not the starting point. They are what became visible after countless earlier nights had already passed on surfaces too ordinary and too fragile to leave much behind. So the silence of archaeology should not make us doubt the title. It should make us hear it more accurately. Most of human history slept without a bed, not because humans failed to invent one soon enough, but because the human world for most of its length was still organized around ground, shelter, warmth, and shared living rather than around permanent furniture made for sleep alone. Sleeping close to the ground was not only an absence of furniture. In many settings, it was also a practical decision shaped by the basic physics of survival. A bed, especially a raised one, creates distance. It separates the body from the surface below and often from the immediate conditions of the shelter around it. But for much of human history, distance was not always the main goal. Sometimes the goal was the opposite: to stay close enough to warmth, close enough to familiar ground, and close enough to other people that the night could be endured with less risk. This is one reason the modern imagination can misunderstand the past. We see the ground and assume discomfort. Earlier humans often saw the ground and asked a different question. Could this place be made safe enough, dry enough, warm enough, and predictable enough to rest on? If the answer was yes, then sleeping near the earth was not a failure to improve life. It was the practical use of what the environment already provided. Warmth was central to that logic. Human bodies lose heat during rest, and sleep makes a person less able to respond quickly to cold. In a world without insulated buildings, thick bedding industries, or reliable indoor temperature control, conserving warmth mattered greatly. The ground itself was not always warm, of course. It could be cold, damp, and punishing, but a sleeping place near a hearth, in a sheltered area, with coverings, plant layers, skins, or shared body heat, could create a workable thermal arrangement without requiring a raised bed. In some conditions, a carefully chosen ground-level place may have been easier to manage than a more elaborate structure that required labor, materials, and long-term stability. Practical life often favors what is good enough and repeatable over what is ideal in theory. That pattern appears again and again across human history. The same was true for safety. To a modern mind, sleeping on the ground can sound exposed, but exposure is not determined by height alone. A body raised above the ground is not automatically safer if the shelter is poor, the fire is far, the group is scattered, or the materials are unstable. Safety in deep history was often social and situational. It came from sleeping near others, within reach of warmth, in a spot already known, in a shelter shaped by habit, and on a surface that did not require a complicated structure to maintain. The logic here is simple. The more conditions that had to be met before rest could happen, the less likely that system was to become universal across the whole span of human life. The ground, improved where possible, required fewer conditions than a true bed. It could be used in temporary camps, in repeated camps, in shelters of different kinds, and across environments where mobility mattered more than permanence. This does not mean the ground was always preferred in some ideal sense. Preference is hard to recover from the past, and the evidence rarely allows such confident psychological claims. It means only that ground-level sleep made sense within a wide range of real constraints. It was materially economical, socially adaptable, and compatible with lives that were not built around fixed furniture. Once we understand that, the title becomes less surprising. Of course, most of human history slept without a bed. The bed depends on settled conditions that arrived late and unevenly. Warmth and safety, by contrast, were ancient needs answered through whatever arrangements people could build directly around the sleeping body. Sometimes that meant layering materials under it. Sometimes it meant clustering bodies together. Sometimes it meant using shelter and fire to make the ground tolerable. The crucial point is that sleep did not wait for a raised surface to become possible. It worked with the immediate world, and for most of the human story, that immediate world still began at ground level, where the body could remain inside the oldest human equation of night: enough warmth, enough safety, enough closeness, and enough shelter to wake again at dawn. The logic of ground-level sleep becomes even clearer when we remember how much of human life was organized around movement, limited materials, and repeated improvisation. A bed is not merely a soft place. It is a commitment. It asks for wood or other structural materials, for time to build, for space to keep it, and for the expectation that the sleeping place will remain useful long enough to justify the effort. Those conditions fit some later forms of settled life, but they do not fit the deepest and longest stretches of human existence very well. For people living in temporary shelters, shifting camps, or environments where mobility remained important, the most sensible sleeping solution was often the one that demanded the least permanent structure. The ground, altered with local materials, met that need. It was already present, and it could be made more tolerable without requiring a separate object to follow the group through changing conditions. This is where practicality matters more than comfort in the modern sense. Human beings do not always build the most luxurious solution available in theory. More often, they settle on what can be repeated with reasonable effort: a layer of plant material gathered nearby, a cleared patch inside a shelter, a position near retained warmth, and the close presence of others could solve enough of the sleeping problem to make a true bed unnecessary. The ground was not perfect, but perfection is a modern expectation. In most of human history, the question was not how to eliminate all discomfort. The question was how to create a survivable night without spending more labor and material than the situation could afford. That balance strongly favored ground-level arrangements. There was also a hidden efficiency in sleeping low. It kept the body near shared heat, near children, near tools, near the familiar center of the occupied space, and near whatever protection the shelter actually provided. A raised structure can create cleanliness and separation, but it can also create distance from the main zone of warmth and from the dense social arrangement that often mattered in older sleeping worlds. In a small shelter or camp, sleep did not need to be elevated to be functional. It needed to be placed well. That is a very different principle. It suggests that ancient sleep was less about owning a distinct object, and more about positioning the body within a usable nighttime environment. Once again, this does not mean raised surfaces never existed in any form. It means they were not the ordinary foundation of human rest across the vast majority of our species' timeline. The ordinary foundation was still environmental skill, knowing where to lie, what to place beneath the body, what to place above it, how close to remain to others, and how to use the sheltering qualities of a place without overbuilding it. This may sound modest, but modest strategies often dominate long periods of history because they are flexible. A bed is powerful only where permanence can support it. The ground is available everywhere. That availability made it the most universal sleeping base human beings ever had. And because it was so universal, the body learned to treat small adjustments as enough. Enough padding, enough warmth, enough shelter, enough closeness. The language of survival is often built around enough. Modern life, by contrast, is built more around optimization. That difference can distort how we look back. We may imagine that earlier humans were trapped below a standard they wished to escape, when in reality they were often living inside standards shaped by mobility, ecology, and material limits rather than by the pursuit of maximum softness. The result is a more disciplined understanding of the title. Humans did not sleep without beds simply because they had not yet invented better ideas. They often slept without beds because the bed was a costly and unnecessary answer to conditions that could be managed more directly. For most of history, the ground remained part of the sleeping solution because it was practical, adaptable, and close to the everyday logic of human survival. In that older world, night did not ask for furniture first. It asked for a place the body could trust, however provisionally, until morning returned. What made the ground so persistent in human sleep was not only necessity, but compatibility. It fit the broader structure of life before the modern world built separate systems for comfort. A bed belongs to a chain of things that must already exist around it. A durable dwelling, enough interior order to preserve sleeping space, materials that can be spared for furniture rather than tools or shelter, and a way of life stable enough that the same object remains useful night after night. But for most of human history, life was often arranged more directly around immediate needs. Shelter might be partial. Occupation of a place might be repeated but not permanent in the modern sense. Materials had to serve many purposes. Under those conditions, the best sleeping arrangement was often the one most closely aligned with everything else the group was already doing. The ground fit that pattern. It did not need to be invented, stored, repaired as furniture, or transported as an object of its own. It only needed to be made workable. That could mean choosing a better patch of surface, clearing debris, adding plant matter, using skins or woven coverings where available, arranging the group for warmth, or lying close to the center of protected space. These are small acts, but they matter historically because small acts can scale across enormous stretches of time. A bed can transform sleep where the world around it can support the transformation. Ground-level sleep can endure almost anywhere human beings are able to improvise. That is why it remained the deeper default of the species. There is also a kind of hidden intelligence in solutions that remain close to the environment. The farther a sleeping system moves from the immediate world, the more infrastructure it usually requires. Modern beds depend not only on craft but on a whole material network. Stable homes, repeated domestic labor, storage, replacement, and the expectation of individual sleeping zones. Earlier human life, especially near its origins, worked with thinner margins. In such a world, a sleeping surface had to be simple enough to emerge from the materials already at hand. That is one reason a ground-level arrangement could solve several problems at once. It could be adapted to weather. It could be shared. It could be abandoned when a place was left and recreated when a new one was found. It did not tie rest to an object more demanding than the circumstances could justify. This helps explain why the absence of beds for most of human history should not be treated as a mystery needing some dramatic answer. The answer is often quiet. Beds were late because the conditions that make beds ordinary were late. The ground endured because it was always available, and because human beings learned how to work with it long before they could afford to replace it with something more specialized. Even when later societies began to create raised sleeping places, mats, platforms, or framed structures, those developments were still departures from a much older baseline. They were not the beginning of human rest. They were refinements layered onto a body already ancient in its nightly habits. And that older baseline still matters because it reveals something about human adaptation itself. Our species has often survived not by waiting for ideal solutions, but by using flexible ones that can travel across climates, landscapes, and social arrangements. The ground was one of those flexible solutions. It was imperfect, but widely compatible with the realities of human life. It could be modified without becoming a separate world. It could hold the body without requiring a piece of furniture to stand between human beings and the earth. That long compatibility is what gives the title its real force. Most of human history slept without a bed because most of human history lived in conditions where the bed was not yet the most sensible answer. Warmth could be shared. Surfaces could be prepared. Shelter could be used. The night could be crossed without raising the body into a constructed sleeping object, and for thousands upon thousands of generations, that was enough. The remarkable fact is not that humans once lacked beds. The remarkable fact is how long a species can build its entire sleeping life around the simple, repeated act of making the ground itself just livable enough to rest upon. For much of human history, sleep was not organized around the individual in the way many people now imagine. The modern bed quietly teaches a very specific lesson about what rest is supposed to look like. One body, one sleeping surface, one private zone, one controlled environment. Even when people share a bed today, the bed itself still belongs to a world of defined sleeping units. It marks out where rest begins and who it belongs to. But the deeper human past was often structured differently. For most of the species' story, sleep was less personal, less separated, and more tightly woven into group life. This matters because the bed is not only a piece of furniture, it is also a social idea. It reflects a world in which a person can claim space, reserve it for later, and return to it night after night as something partly their own. That kind of stable personal sleeping territory was not the baseline of human existence. shared sleep was much closer to that baseline, not because earlier humans had no sense of comfort or no need for boundaries, but because warmth, safety, childcare, and the limits of shelter often favored closeness over separation. In such conditions, the sleeping surface was not just where one body rested, it was where the group arranged itself against the night. This is one of the clearest ways the modern bed can distort our view of the past. It makes privacy feel natural and shared sleep feel like an exception. Yet on the scale of human history, the opposite may be closer to the truth. Shared rest likely dominated for long periods because it matched the practical realities of life before large houses, spare rooms, stable heating, and abundant household goods. People slept near those they depended on, and those who depended on them. Adults remained near children. The vulnerable remained near the able. Warmth could be pooled. Fear could be reduced. The darkness was not faced as a set of isolated individuals each retreating into a separate sleeping object, but as a cluster of bodies lying within reach of one another. That arrangement did not require a bed for every person. In many settings it worked better without one. The more sleep is organized collectively, the less necessary a personal raised structure becomes. What matters instead is enough protected surface for the group, enough material beneath or around them, and enough nearness for the night to remain manageable. This is why the title touches more than furniture. To sleep without a bed for most of human history also meant, very often, to sleep without the modern assumption that rest belongs to an individual zone. The older human pattern was likely more shared, more negotiated, and more responsive to the needs of the group as a whole. Even when some kind of bedding material was used, it would often have existed within that collective arrangement, rather than replacing it with separate personal spaces. Sleep happened inside relationships. That fact becomes easier to see when we remember where our species began. Human life started in small groups moving through landscapes where survival depended heavily on cooperation. Food, protection, care for the young, knowledge of place, and response to danger were all social. It would be strange if sleep alone had developed as a strongly individualized activity under those conditions. Much more likely is that sleep, too, reflected the same basic structure of dependence and proximity. The body lay down not only on a surface, but within a network of nearby bodies, and once we see that clearly, the bed begins to look even newer than before. It is not only a later material solution, it is part of a later social world in which privacy expands. Domestic space becomes more divided, and the sleeping person is gradually separated from the collective surface of the group. For most of human history, that separation had not yet become normal. The human night was still shared, and the ground, however prepared, remained a common place of rest rather than a set of individual beds waiting in the dark. A shared sleeping world changes the meaning of comfort itself. In modern life, comfort is often measured by how well a surface fits one individual body. The mattress should support the spine, the pillow should suit one neck, the bed should be wide enough for personal ease, and the room should protect private sleep from interruption. These expectations are so familiar that they can feel biologically obvious, but they depend on a setting where the individual has become the primary unit of rest. In much of the older human world, comfort was shaped by a different question. Not what is best for one body in isolation, but what arrangement allows several bodies to rest together with the greatest chance of warmth, safety, and continuity through the night. That shift matters because once comfort becomes collective, the logic of the bed changes. A personal raised structure is no longer the most natural answer. The more important answer may be a shared surface, a protected corner, enough insulating material, and a bodily arrangement that keeps the group intact. In such a world, sleep remains human and meaningful, but its shape is different from what many people now expect. This helps explain why modern intuitions can misread the past so easily. We tend to imagine that separate beds must be an improvement in every context because we inherit a world built around personal space. Yet for long stretches of human history, separation may have carried costs as well as benefits. To sleep too far from others could mean less warmth, less immediate help, more risk for children, and greater exposure to fear or danger in the dark. Even in later historical periods, many households across the world continued to organize sleep collectively when material limits or social habits favored closeness. That does not prove one timeless model. But it does remind us that the modern image of solitary, individualized sleep is not the only workable human arrangement. On the deeper timescale of the species, it is likely a relatively recent one. The older pattern appears to have been less about perfect bodily customization and more about making rest possible for the group. This is where the title gains another layer. To say that most of human history slept without a bed is also to say that most of human history probably did not organize sleep around the isolated body. The body rested as part of a cluster, a family, a camp, a shelter, a shared human environment. The surface mattered, but the nearness of others also mattered. What lay beneath the body was only one part of the sleeping system. Who lay beside it, who could hear movement, who could provide warmth, who could respond to a child, who occupied the edge of the group, and who remained in the center all shaped the meaning of the night. Sleep, under those conditions, was less like retreat and more like temporary collective withdrawal. The group lowered its activity together. That idea becomes harder to see once beds become normal, because beds visually separate people even when they remain in the same house. Each person appears to own a zone of rest. Earlier sleep was often less divided. A person did not necessarily withdraw into a private unit. They lay down inside a common arrangement. That arrangement may sometimes have been crowded, imperfect, or uncomfortable by modern standards, but it was not random. It reflected the social logic of survival. The sleeping surface and the sleeping group belong together. That is one reason the bed is not simply a better version of older rest. It is part of a broader reorganization of human domestic life. It turns collective rest into something more segmented, more personal, and more materially defined. Before that reorganization, the earth or the prepared floor remained the base on which shared sleep could happen most flexibly. It could hold many bodies at once. It could be adjusted with available materials. It could keep adults, children, and elders in one meaningful arrangement. And because that arrangement matched the older human world so well, it helps explain why separate beds arrived late. The problem earlier humans were solving was not how to give each person a private sleeping platform. It was how to get the whole group through the night together. For most of history, the answer to that problem remained closer to the ground than to the bed. When we place all of this together, the bed begins to look less like a timeless necessity and more like the end point of a very long social change. The older human night was not built around personal furniture waiting for separate individuals. It was built around the group and whatever shared surface could hold that group in relative safety until dawn. In such a world, the ground was not merely tolerated. It was the common base that allowed sleep to remain collective. It could be covered, softened, cleared, and arranged, but it did not need to be divided into fixed units for each person. That is a deeply different model of rest from the one many people now take for granted. Today, the bed often stands at the center of ideas like privacy, ownership, bodily preference, and even identity. People choose their mattress, their side of the bed, their room, their sleeping schedule. Those ideas feel normal because they belong to a domestic world shaped by settled homes and strong personal boundaries. But most humans who ever lived were formed in a different sleeping world. One where the body came to rest not by withdrawing into private space, but by remaining inside a shared human field. This does not mean that earlier people lacked boundaries or that all shared sleep was harmonious. Real life was surely more complex than that. Closeness can comfort, but it can also crowd. Shared space can protect, but it can also reduce privacy. Yet the historical point remains. The problem earlier humans were solving each night was collective before it was individual. How do we keep enough warmth? How do we keep children near? How do we organize vulnerable bodies inside limited shelter? How do we remain close enough to respond if danger comes? Those questions do not automatically lead to one bed per person. More often, they lead to shared ground, shared coverings, shared vigilance, and shared rhythms of rest. This is why the bed belongs to more than the history of furniture. It belongs to the history of separation. It emerges more fully when houses become more divided, when domestic interiors become more specialized, and when social life allows people to claim portions of the night as their own. Before that long transition, the sleeping world of our species was still largely communal in structure, even if the exact arrangement varied from place to place. The body's relationship to the ground was therefore also a relationship to the group. To lie down was not only to meet a surface, it was to take one's place inside a larger pattern of rest. That pattern may have shifted with climate, shelter, season, danger, and the size of the group, but it remained fundamentally different from the modern image of individualized sleep. And once we understand that, the title begins to sound less like a statement about deprivation and more like a statement about human organization. Most of human history slept without a bed because most of human history also slept without the social conditions that make separate beds seem obvious. The bed requires not only materials and craft, but a particular kind of domestic world. A shared sleeping surface requires much less. It fits a species whose earliest life was mobile, cooperative, and exposed to the demands of the environment. That is why it lasted so long. It matched the deep structure of human existence before privacy, stable furniture, and divided interiors became ordinary. The real historical shift was not simply from hard ground to soft mattress. It was from common sleep to more individualized sleep, from collective arrangement to personal territory, from bodies resting together on one workable surface to bodies increasingly lifted apart. For most of human history, that shift had not yet happened. The night still belonged to the group, and the ground, however prepared, remained the shared surface on which human beings lowered themselves into darkness together. The sleeping world of children makes this history even clearer. A modern bed often marks the beginning of personal sleep very early in life. There may be a crib, a small mattress, a separate sleeping surface, and eventually a room of one's own. These arrangements now feel so normal that they can seem like the natural way human life begins. But on the scale of deep history, they are very recent. For most of human existence, the first experience of sleep was almost certainly not separation onto a dedicated bed, but closeness to another body and closeness to a shared sleeping surface. Human infants are unusually dependent for a long time. They need carrying, feeding, warmth, protection, and frequent attention. That dependence alone suggests that the sleeping life of early childhood in the deep human past would have been tightly connected to the bodies of caregivers and to the sleeping space of the group rather than organized around an independent piece of furniture made for one child. We should be careful here, because the evidence does not allow us to reconstruct every arrangement in detail. Different societies, climates, shelters, and material conditions would have shaped nighttime care in different ways. But the broader logic is strong enough to state with confidence. In a species whose young require prolonged care, and in a long human past where built beds were not ordinary, early sleep would have unfolded within shared environments rather than inside the separate child-centered sleep systems familiar today. This matters because it shows that sleeping without a bed was not only the condition of adults, it was woven into human development from the beginning of life. The first nights of infancy, the long vulnerable period of early childhood, the years when fear, cold, hunger, and dependence were all strongest. These were not lived out on a line of personal mattresses waiting in order of age. They were lived much closer to bodies, coverings, and common ground. The child's sleeping surface was therefore not just a material surface. It was part of a larger arrangement of care. To sleep near an adult could mean more than warmth. It could mean quicker feeding, quicker response to distress, easier protection, and less separation in a world where the night carried real uncertainty. The modern bed, especially when associated with independent sleep, belongs to a different social setting, one in which domestic interiors are larger, household goods are more abundant, and the division of persons into separate sleeping spaces begins much earlier. Most of human history did not begin there. It began with dependency managed through closeness. That closeness changes how we should imagine the surface of sleep itself. The child did not simply lie on the same kind of ground as an adult in some abstract way. The child slept as part of a human arrangement made around vulnerability. Whatever materials were used, skins, plant matter, woven coverings, or simple prepared surfaces, they would have existed inside the larger fact of bodily nearness. This helps us see the title more fully. The absence of beds was not merely a feature of prehistoric hardship or simplicity. It was part of a wider human pattern in which life began on shared surfaces, among others, without the strong spatial separation that later domestic worlds would make possible. In that sense, the history of childhood and the history of the bed are connected. The more a society can separate sleepers by age, status, role, and preference, the more natural a bed-centered world can seem. But a species that spent most of its existence raising children in intimate, collective, materially modest settings would have known something else first. It would have known sleep as contact, as dependence, as protection, and as a shared condition of the night. The child entered sleep not by being placed into a timeless human object, but by being held inside the oldest sleeping environment our species ever had, the near presence of other people on a surface still close to the earth. That early closeness matters for another reason. It reminds us that the sleeping surface in human history was never only about where the body lay, but about how care was organized through the night. A bed in the modern sense can separate functions, one place for the child, another for the parent, one zone for rest, another for waking life. But in much of the deeper human past, those distinctions would have been harder to maintain and often less useful. Nighttime care had to remain immediate. Infants and small children do not pause their needs because darkness has arrived. They wake, cry, feed, seek warmth, and depend on quick human response. In a world without large insulated houses, abundant furniture, and multiple dedicated sleeping rooms, the most workable arrangement was often the one that kept care physically close. That does not tell us every detail of prehistoric sleep, and it should not be stretched into overly precise claims, but it does support a broad and sober conclusion. Childhood sleep for most of human history was likely folded into shared sleeping environments, rather than separated into individual bed spaces, the way many modern households now expect. This is where the title acquires a generational depth. To say that most human history slept without a bed is also to say that people learned what nighttime felt like before beds became normal. They learned it first as children. Their first memories of rest, if remembered at all, would not have centered on personal furniture but on the textures of shared life. The nearness of bodies, the sounds of breathing, the uneven but familiar feel of coverings and ground beneath them, the warmth of adults, the limits of shelter, the rhythms of waking and settling in the dark. Even when sleeping surfaces were improved with skins, mats, or gathered plant materials, those improvements did not yet create the kind of separation that later beds would make common. They softened the shared surface, but they did not fully divide it. That means the human experience of childhood was formed for a very long time inside a world where sleep and dependence remained physically intertwined. This also changes how we think about the meaning of security. In modern domestic life, security is often built into architecture and objects. Doors close, heating runs, cribs and beds assign places. Parents may be near, but the room itself provides part of the protection. In older human settings, security had to be more bodily and relational. It came through watchfulness, proximity, and the practical arrangement of sleeping bodies within a limited space. The child's safety was not delegated to furniture. It remained embedded in the presence of others. That difference does not make the past better or worse in any simple way. It only shows that the bed is part of a later system in which architecture, privacy, and material abundance take over tasks that were once handled more directly through shared bodily life. The deeper history of sleep began before that system existed, and because it began there, the child's place in the story is essential. Children reveal what is most basic in any human arrangement, because their needs expose the structure around them. If beds had been central to the human condition from the start, we would expect early life to revolve around them. But the long logic of human dependence points elsewhere. It points towards surfaces that could be shared, toward caregivers remaining close, and toward the sleeping environment as part of a broader system of touch, response, and protection rather than as a set of private sleeping units. For most of the species past, that older arrangement was not an exception. It was the background of life. Children entered the night as members of a sleeping group, not as isolated owners of a bed. And because every generation began there, the bed appears once again for what it is, not the ancient center of human sleep, but a late domestic technology that gradually replaced a much older world in which care, warmth, and rest all took place together on surfaces still tied to the ground. When childhood begins on a shared surface, a bed becomes more than unnecessary. It becomes historically out of place. The first human lessons about night were not usually lessons in personal space. They were lessons in dependence, closeness, waiting, warmth, and the small forms of protection that came from being near others. A child did not enter sleep through a separate object standing at a distance from adult life. The child entered sleep inside adult life, within reach of care, on whatever surface the group had made workable. This is one of the clearest reasons the bed belongs to a later phase of human history. It assumes that a society has enough material stability and enough spatial division to separate the sleeping needs of children from the sleeping needs of everyone else. That is a large assumption. For most of the human story, it was not the normal condition. Shelters were often limited. Resources had many competing uses. The practical demands of feeding, carrying, protecting, and monitoring the young made closeness more useful than separation. In such a world, the child's sleeping place was not best understood as a small version of an adult bedroom. It was part of a shared field of life in which sleep, care, and vulnerability remained tightly joined. This also helps explain why the modern bed can feel so natural even though it is historically new. We encounter it early. It becomes folded into memory from childhood onward. A crib, a blanket, a mattress, a room, a bedtime routine. These shape the modern imagination so strongly that they begin to look like human universals. But they are not. They belong to a domestic order made possible by settled housing, manufactured goods, and increasingly specialized interiors. Before that order became common, children still slept, still grew, still needed comfort, and still passed through fear and fatigue. They simply did so in a sleeping world structured more by human presence than by furniture. That older world matters because it reveals what sleep originally had to rely on. It relied on bodies before it relied on objects. It relied on nearness before it relied on architecture. It relied on shared surfaces before it relied on private ones. And since every human life begins in dependency, childhood offers one of the strongest windows into the deep past. The way a society lets children sleep often reveals what that society can build, what it can spare, what it fears, and how it organizes care. In the long early history of our species, those answers seem to point again and again towards shared sleeping environments close to the ground. Even if coverings, padding, or simple bedding materials were used, they existed inside that larger arrangement. They did not yet replace it with rows of separate beds. That is why the child remains central to the title. Most of human history slept without a bed, not only because adults did, but because human life itself began under conditions where a bed was not the expected starting point. Nighttime dependence was solved socially before it was solved materially. Warmth came from nearness. Reassurance came from proximity. Sleep began in a cluster, not in isolation. And when enough generations live that way, it shapes the very baseline of what rest is. The child learns the night as something shared. The caregiver learns sleep as something interrupted and collective. And the group learns that vulnerability is best managed together. Only much later, when houses grow larger, domestic roles become more partitioned, and sleeping spaces can be assigned more strictly, does the bed start to appear as the proper place where childhood should unfold. But that later idea should not be projected backward too easily. For most of the species' existence, the first sleeping world was not a nursery. It was the human group itself, settled for a few hours in darkness on a surface still close to the earth. In that sense, the history of the bed is also the history of how far sleep gradually moved away from the original conditions of human care. Childhood shows us that distance clearly. It shows us that before sleep belonged to furniture, it belonged to relationship. And before it belonged to a bed, it belonged to the ground shared with others. At some point in human history, sleeping surfaces began to rise. Not everywhere at once, not for everyone, and not in a single straight line, but slowly, unevenly, and under particular conditions. This is an important turning point, because it helps us see the bed not as a timeless human need, but as a development that became more useful only when other parts of life changed first. A raised sleeping place requires more than desire for comfort. It requires enough stability and shelter, enough material control, and enough reason to separate the body from the ground in a lasting way. That means the story of the bed begins not with sleep itself, but with the gradual appearance of worlds in which lifting the body became worth the effort. One reason for that shift may have been environmental pressure. In some places, moisture, insects, cold ground, dirt, or repeated indoor use could make elevation more attractive. In other places, even a low platform, a woven base, or a structured mat could create useful distance between the body and the surface below. But we should be careful here. The movement from ground to raised sleep was not a universal leap, and not always a clean one. Ground-level rest continued for enormous stretches of time, and in many societies different sleeping arrangements likely existed side by side. The important point is not that humans suddenly discovered the obvious advantage of a bed. It is that some later forms of life made raised sleeping places more practical, more sustainable, and more meaningful than they had been before. Settlement was part of that change. The more people remained in one place, the more sense it made to shape interiors in durable ways. Once a shelter becomes more permanent, the sleeping area can also become more permanent. Surfaces can be improved not just for tonight, but for repeated nights. Materials can be dedicated to comfort because they do not have to be carried away tomorrow. The logic of sleep changes when a household expects to return to the same interior again and again. That is one of the deepest differences between the early human world and the later one. A raised sleeping place is easier to justify when the place itself stays put. Domestic accumulation also matters. A society that stores tools, vessels, textiles, coverings, and household objects creates a new relationship between life and material space. Under those conditions, a sleeping place can become one object among others, something owned, maintained, and improved over time. The bed begins to emerge more clearly in a world where human beings are no longer only adapting to surfaces, but increasingly constructing the surfaces on which daily life will unfold. Even then, however, the raised sleeping place should not be imagined too quickly in modern terms. A low platform, a woven frame, a built surface, or a structured mat is not yet the full modern bed with all the meanings it later gathers. What matters is the direction of change. The body is beginning to move away from direct contact with the ground, and that movement reflects broader historical shifts in housing, labour, material culture, and domestic order. This is why the rise of sleeping surfaces must be understood as part of a larger transformation of human life. People are not only changing where they sleep, they are changing how they inhabit space. The shelter is becoming more than temporary cover. The interior is becoming organised. The sleeping body is becoming more separate from the floor, and often more separate from the shared human field that defined earlier rest. That does not mean older patterns disappear immediately. They remain for a long time. But the possibility has appeared for sleep to occupy its own constructed zone more regularly. This is the beginning of the long departure from the earth. Not a total break, not a universal replacement, but a slow historical reorientation. For most of human history, sleep remained close to the ground because the world around the sleeper was still built that way. Raised sleeping places began to matter only when the world itself began to rise into more stable, more divided, and more materially managed forms of life. Once raised sleeping places begin to appear, they should not be misunderstood as an instant human upgrade that spread automatically because everyone recognized their superiority. History is rarely that clean. A raised surface only becomes normal when it fits the wider conditions of life. If a household is still mobile, if shelters are temporary, if interior space is limited, or if materials are too valuable to dedicate to furniture, then even a useful idea may remain uncommon. That is why the emergence of elevated sleep tells us less about a sudden discovery and more about changing thresholds. Certain societies reached points where lifting the body from the ground became easier to justify. The reasons could vary. Dampness may have made the floor unpleasant. Repeated indoor occupation may have made cleaner separation desirable. Insects or pests may have encouraged distance from the ground in some settings. Stored household goods may have increased the sense that interiors should be organized into distinct functional zones. Whatever the local mix of reasons, the larger pattern is the same. The more durable the house, the more meaningful a durable sleeping surface can become. This also means the rise of the bed is tied to changing ideas of domestic order. A ground-level sleeping place can be remade each night from what is available. A raised sleeping place, by contrast, begins to claim part of the room in advance. It marks an area not just as usable, but as reserved. That is historically significant. It means the sleeping body is no longer negotiating with the immediate environment in the same way. Instead, the environment has already been partly reorganized to anticipate sleep before the sleeper even arrives. This is one of the most important transitions in the whole story. The bed, even in a simple form, is not just a comfort device. It is a pre-arranged promise that rest will happen here, in this location, above this floor, within this household order. That promise depends on stability. It also depends on the ability to spare labor for repeated structure rather than daily improvisation. In earlier human settings, effort often went toward making the ground workable night by night. In later settled settings, effort could increasingly go toward making one sleeping place persist across time. That persistence changes the emotional and social meaning of sleep. The sleeper begins to inherit not only a biological rhythm, but a domestic position. A person has a place. A household has fixed sleeping areas. The interior becomes less fluid. This should not be exaggerated too soon, because many historical societies preserved mixed systems. Mats, platforms, shared sleeping surfaces, and simpler floor arrangements remained common in many times and places even when more formal beds existed elsewhere. The path upward was never universal, and the raised bed did not instantly erase the older closeness to the ground. Still, the direction matters. As houses became more enduring and domestic materials more numerous, sleep could be separated from the floor more deliberately and more often. The body began to leave the earth by degrees. Even a small degree of elevation mattered, because it symbolized a larger reordering of life. It meant humans were starting to treat sleep less as something improvised inside a natural surface and more as something housed within an object or a built feature of the room. This is why the emergence of raised sleep should be understood as a threshold, not a revolution. It marks the point where certain historical worlds could finally support a different answer to the ancient problem of night. But it does not rewrite the larger proportion. The raised sleeping place may be important, but it arrives after an immense span in which the ground remained the normal base of human rest. For tens of thousands of years, the body met the night with surfaces only slightly modified from the environment around it. The bed appears much later, when settlement, stored goods, and more stable interiors begin to make separation from the ground materially sensible. That later change is real, but it only stands out because the older human condition lasted so long. Raised sleep matters in history precisely because it was not the beginning. It was a departure from something far older, the long age in which human beings slept where life itself still touched the earth. As sleeping surfaces slowly rose, they began to do more than change posture or comfort. They began to reshape the meaning of the room itself. A floor can remain open to many uses. It can hold work, food preparation, conversation, care, storage, and rest in shifting patterns across the day. But once a sleeping structure begins to occupy a fixed place, the room changes. Part of the interior is now claimed in advance for sleep. This may seem like a small architectural detail, yet historically it marks a profound movement. It means that rest is no longer only something the body negotiates each night with local conditions. It is becoming something the household prepares for by shaping space ahead of time. That change could only happen where life had become stable enough to support it. A raised sleeping place needs continuity. It needs a shelter that will not be abandoned too quickly, materials that can remain in place, and an interior order that is worth maintaining from one night to the next. This is why the rise of elevated sleep belongs to the larger history of settled domestic life. It appears when houses become less temporary, when repeated occupation turns interior surfaces into managed environments, and when the sleeping body begins to occupy a more permanent relationship to space. Even then, however, the raised sleeping place does not instantly become the normal condition for everyone. For a long time, different worlds likely overlapped. Some people may have slept on mats or layered materials on the ground. Others may have used low platforms or simple raised structures. Some households may have mixed these approaches according to age, status, season, or available room. The important thing is not to imagine a sudden replacement of the old human sleeping world. The important thing is to see a gradual widening of options, driven by new material and social conditions. A bed, or something moving in that direction, could now begin to exist not just as an occasional solution, but as part of domestic design. This also changes the relationship between the body and the environment. The higher the sleeping surface rises, the more sleep becomes separated from the immediate logic of the ground. Moisture, dirt, roughness, and unevenness matter differently once the body is lifted. a new buffer appears between human rest and the earth. That buffer is not only physical, it is symbolic. It says that the household has become capable of interposing an object between the sleeper and the raw surface below. That is a major departure from the earliest human condition, where sleep remained entangled with the floor, the shelter, the weather, and the presence of others in one shared sleeping field. Now the surface itself begins to carry social meaning. It may signal permanence. It may signal order. It may even begin to hint at rank or distinction, though those meanings will grow more clearly later. What matters here is the first shift. Sleep is starting to belong to a built structure rather than only to a prepared patch of ground. The room now remembers sleep before the body lies down. That is something the older human world could rarely do in a durable way. And once a household can remember sleep materially, it can begin to organize life around that memory. A place is left untouched because it is for resting. Materials are preserved because they support comfort. Space is arranged in anticipation of night. This is the early domestic logic from which the fuller bed will eventually emerge. Still, the long human proportion should remain in view. Raised sleeping places matter historically because they are a departure, not because they erase what came before. Behind every platform, every framed surface, every woven structure raised above the floor, there lies a vastly older inheritance. Generations upon generations for whom sleep happened close to the earth, in spaces made workable but not yet transformed into furniture. The rise of elevated sleep is therefore best understood not as the beginning of human rest, but as the beginning of a new relationship between rest and space. The human body is starting to leave the ground more consistently, but only because the human world around it has begun to change first. Houses are stabilizing, interiors are thickening with objects. The night is being domesticated, and slowly, within that quieter and more managed world, the bed begins to become imaginable as something ordinary. It is still far from universal, but the direction has changed. The ground is no longer the only serious answer. A second answer has started to rise above it. Even after beds began to appear more clearly in some historical societies, they did not immediately become the ordinary possession of everyone. This is a crucial point, because it protects the title from a common misunderstanding. The story is not that humans suddenly invented beds and then left the ground behind. The story is that for a long time, raised sleeping places belonged unevenly to the social world. In many settings, they were limited by wealth, household resources, craft, available space, and status. That means the bed was not only a material innovation, it was also, very often, a marker of distinction. To have a bed in a recognizable and durable sense could mean that a household had enough permanence to support one, enough resources to build or acquire one, and enough interior order to reserve a part of space for that specific object. None of those conditions can be assumed across the whole population in earlier times. This is why beds matter historically not simply as useful things, but as visible signs that some people could live differently from others. Once a society develops more complex divisions of wealth and power, the sleeping surface begins to reveal those divisions. Some bodies are still close to the ground, others begin to rise above it. That change is not just about comfort, it is about hierarchy entering the night. A raised bed can suggest more than softness. It can suggest ownership, protection, and the ability to turn part of the house into a zone reserved for one person, one couple, or one social role. In many historical settings, such privilege would not have been distributed equally. That matters because it shows how misleading it would be to treat the bed as a fully shared human baseline, even after it first emerged. For long periods, beds likely existed alongside older forms of sleeping rather than replacing them universally. One household might maintain a framed or raised sleeping structure, while others still relied on mats, layered coverings, or prepared floor surfaces. Even within the same household, sleeping arrangements could differ according to age, rank, or function. The bed, in that world, is not yet the ordinary object many modern people assume it to be. It is still partial, selective, and socially meaningful. This also helps explain why the bed accumulated symbolic power. An object becomes socially visible when it is not yet universal. It attracts meaning because it can separate those who have it from those who do not. A bed can then become associated with domestic authority, with wealth, with stability, with refinement, or with elevated social position. It is no longer just a physical solution to the problem of sleep. It is a statement about the kind of household one belongs to, and yet behind that statement, the deeper human past remains unchanged. Most of the species' history had already passed without such distinctions being organized through beds. The bed could become a symbol only because it arrived late enough to stand out. The ground had been too universal and too ordinary to carry that same kind of prestige. Everyone had some relation to it. A bed, by contrast, could become desirable precisely because it marked separation from the common sleeping base of earlier human life. This makes the title even more precise. Most of human history slept without a bed, not only because beds came late, but because when they did arrive, they were often not the property of the many. They emerged first within unequal worlds. That means the historical spread of the bed was slower and narrower than modern instinct might suggest. For many generations after raised sleeping structures became thinkable, large numbers of people may still have slept on surfaces much closer to the earth. The bed was present, but not yet normal in the broad democratic sense many people now assume. It stood above the ground both physically and socially. And that double elevation matters. It reminds us that the modern bed is not simply the end point of a neutral technological improvement. It is also the product of historical worlds in which comfort, space, and material security were distributed unevenly. The human body remained ancient. The bed remained selective. For a very long time, the two did not belong together for everyone. A bed becomes truly ordinary only when society stops noticing it. As long as it remains expensive, uncommon, or tied to special households, it still functions partly as a sign. That is why its earlier history cannot be told only through comfort. It must also be told through inequality. In many historical settings, the raised sleeping surface was meaningful precisely because it was not widely shared. It separated some people from the everyday ground-level reality that still shaped the nights of many others. This does not mean all non-elite sleep was identical, or that everyone without a bed simply lay on bare earth. There could be mats, layered textiles, rushes, straw, skin, simple platforms, and many other arrangements depending on place and period. But the broader contrast still holds. A true bed, especially one with a durable frame and a socially recognized place within the house, often belonged first to those with greater means. The difference may seem domestic and quiet, yet it reveals a larger truth. Social hierarchy does not stop at food, clothing, or architecture. It extends into rest. Even sleep can be stratified. Some people inherit a surface that lifts them, cushions them, and reserves space for them. Others inherit a sleeping life much closer to the floor, more shared, more temporary, or more materially modest. This matters because it shows that the bed did not simply spread through history by being obviously better in every situation. It spread through worlds already marked by uneven access to resources. To sleep in a bed could mean more than physical ease. It could mean living in a household with enough surplus to turn comfort into a durable object. It could mean having enough room that sleep did not need to compete every night with every other use of the floor. It could mean belonging to a social layer whose domestic life had begun to separate itself from the common rhythms of ordinary habitation. In that sense, the bed is part of the history of privilege. It creates elevation where elevation itself can be meaningful. To lie above the floor is to experience a small version of a larger pattern. Some lives become more insulated from the direct pressures of the environment than others. The floor remains a shared human inheritance, but the bed begins to mark an escape from it. That escape, however, was slow and incomplete. It did not erase older sleeping arrangements all at once. For long stretches of time, ground-level sleep and bed-based sleep likely coexisted within the same society, sometimes even within the same building. The old human relationship with the ground was not easily replaced because it had deep practical roots. It required fewer specialized materials, less dedicated space, and less wealth. That is why the bed's rise should not be imagined as a simple civilizational triumph. It was also a narrowing. What had once been a common human condition began to acquire new social meanings. The ground came to look lower not only physically but symbolically. The bed came to look elevated not only practically but culturally. And once that symbolism takes hold, people begin to forget how recent the distinction actually is. They start to imagine that proper sleep has always belonged above the floor, when in fact the floor was the human baseline for almost all of our past. This is one of the quietest but most revealing shifts in the whole story. A species that once solved sleep collectively and close to the earth gradually enters societies where the quality of one's sleep surface reflects one's place in the social order. The night itself becomes more divided. Some sleepers rise into privacy, softness, and dedicated structure. Others remain closer to the older world of shared surfaces and modest arrangements. The bed, then, is not only evidence of comfort becoming possible, it is evidence of comfort becoming unevenly distributed, and that is why it remained unfit to stand for humanity as a whole through most of history. It belonged first to particular people in particular worlds. The species was still far older than the object, and most human beings were still much closer to the ground than later memory would admit. When a bed begins as a marker of distinction, it changes more than where people sleep. It changes what people imagine sleep should mean. An object first associated with privilege can, over time, become the model of normality. That is one of the most powerful shifts in material history. What starts as selective later comes to feel universal. The bed followed that path. At first, where it appeared in a more durable and recognizable form, it likely belonged to households with more stability, more resources, more control over space, and more ability to shape interiors around lasting comfort. But once such arrangements gain prestige, they do more than serve those who already possess them. They begin to define aspiration. A raised sleeping place no longer appears simply as one option among many. It appears as the better, higher, more proper way to rest. This is how the bed slowly moves from being a sign of status to being an ideal, even before it becomes common. That transition matters because it helps explain how quickly historical memory can narrow. After enough time passes, people forget that beds were once limited, and forget even more easily that before they were limited, they were absent. The long age of shared surfaces, ground-level rest, and sleeping arrangements built from modest local materials begins to disappear behind later assumptions about what a normal human night should look like. This is one reason the title can feel strange even though it is historically proportionate. Modern people inherit the endpoint of the story and instinctively project it backward. They see the bed in nearly every stage of their own lives and assume it must somehow belong to life itself. But the bed only gained that authority gradually, through worlds in which comfort and privacy first became advantages of the few and only later spread more widely. That means even the cultural prestige of the bed is a late arrival. For most of human history, no such prestige was possible, because no such object stood at the center of ordinary rest. The human body did not need a symbol of elevated sleep. It needed enough warmth, enough safety, enough closeness, and enough support from the immediate environment to survive the night. Only when societies became more layered, more materially dense, and more spatially organized could the bed rise into view as something socially meaningful. Once it did, however, it began to reshape judgment. Ground-level sleep could now come to seem lower in every sense. Poorer, rougher, less refined, less complete. The bed, by contrast, could stand for advancement, order, and domestic success. Yet this symbolic reversal hides the deeper truth. The ground was not the failed beginning from which civilized sleep finally escaped. It was the original human condition of rest, maintained across immense stretches of time because it matched the real structure of life. The bed became admirable only against the background of that older common world. Its status depended on contrast. To rise above the floor had meaning only because most human beings had always lived so close to it. This is why the bed should be understood as both an object and a social story. It is made of material but also of comparison. It becomes powerful when it can separate one sleeping life from another. And once that separation is admired, the object gathers force beyond its practical function. It starts to define what proper rest should look like, even for those who do not yet have access to it. That is how selective comfort becomes cultural common sense. Still, the deeper proportion does not change. Most humans who ever slept did so before the bed became ordinary, and many who lived after its emergence still did not possess one in the stronger modern sense. The older human relationship to the ground remained far more widespread and far more enduring than later ideals would suggest. So the bed's symbolic rise should not mislead us about its true place in history. It stood above the ground socially long before it stood above the ground for everyone materially. That delay matters. It reminds us that what feels most normal in one age may begin as the privilege of a few and remain, for a very long time, far from the baseline of the species as a whole. In the long history of sleep, the bed became important slowly, unequally, and late. The ground had already carried humanity much farther. The journey from ground to mattress was not a single invention. It was a long chain of small separations. First came the simple effort to make the earth more tolerable, clearing stones, choosing drier patches, laying down grasses, leaves, skins, or woven materials, finding shelter from wind, and keeping close to warmth. These early adjustments did not remove the body from the ground. They only softened the contact, but over time, in some places, the contact itself began to change. A mat can still lie on the floor, yet it already creates a thin layer between flesh and earth. A platform can still feel simple, yet it begins to lift the body out of direct contact with the surface below. A framed sleeping place goes further still. Step by step, the human body is moved away from the raw ground and into a more deliberately constructed sleeping world. This slow movement matters because it shows how misleading it would be to imagine the bed as a sudden leap from discomfort to comfort. The real history is gradual. Each stage adds a little more distance, a little more predictability, and a little more control over what the body feels at night. That control depends on larger changes happening around sleep. Houses become more durable, interiors become more organized. Materials become easier to store, shape, and dedicate to repeated domestic use. The sleeping place begins to persist from one night to the next, instead of being remade from circumstance alone. This persistence is one of the most important turning points in the entire story. Once a sleeping surface remains in place, the household starts to carry memory in material form. The place where one slept yesterday can still be there tomorrow. The room starts to anticipate sleep before the body lies down. That anticipation is a major departure from the older human condition, where the night often had to be negotiated more directly with the immediate environment. It is also at this point that the bed starts to gather layers beyond simple support. It can now hold coverings, padding, woven bases, stuffed materials, and eventually more complex forms of comfort. None of this appears all at once, and none of it spreads equally to everyone. But the direction is clear. Sleep is becoming less dependent on the accidental qualities of the ground and more dependent on human-built surfaces designed to regularize rest. This is not only a material shift, it is also a historical shift in expectation. Once enough people become used to sleeping on prepared and elevated surfaces, they begin to feel that such surfaces are the proper setting for sleep. What was once an innovation becomes a standard. The ground, which had served humanity for almost all of its past, begins to feel like a fallback rather than the baseline. Yet that feeling is produced by very recent layers of history. It should not be projected backward too easily. For most of human existence, the body still entered sleep through direct contact with a world not yet fully softened by furniture. The long road toward the mattress only makes sense because that earlier condition lasted so long. In fact, the mattress itself is one of the clearest examples of how far this transformation eventually went. A mattress does not merely support the body, it standardizes softness. It cushions weight. It creates a surface that has already solved many of the small problems the ground once presented: pressure, roughness, unevenness, cold transfer, and the unpredictability of local terrain. But the mattress sits at the far end of a deep history of problem solving. Behind it lies the mat, the platform, the frame, the layered covering, the prepared floor, the cleared ground, and before all of those, the simple reality of a body needing sleep in whatever place the world allowed. So when we trace the road from ground to mattress, we are not tracing a clean path from primitive life to modern life. We are tracing the accumulation of distance between the sleeper and the earth. That distance took a very long time to build. It moved in small steps, across unequal societies, through changing houses, materials, and expectations. And the reason the mattress now feels ordinary is not because it belongs to the beginning of the human story, but because it belongs to one of its most recent layers, built slowly over a sleeping history that began with the ground itself. As that distance from the ground increased, sleep became more standardized. This may be one of the least dramatic but most important changes in the story. Ground-level sleep is always somewhat local. It depends on the surface available, the shelter at hand, the materials nearby, the season, the weather, and the number of bodies sharing space. Even when people improve the ground with mats, coverings, or plant layers, the sleeping experience still varies from place to place. A mattress changes that logic. It makes the body encounter something designed to feel more similar each night, regardless of what lies beneath the house itself. In other words, the long road from ground to mattress is also the road from variable sleep surfaces to increasingly controlled ones. That control reflects a broader human shift. Over time, many societies became better at reducing environmental unpredictability inside the home. Floors became more stable, walls more durable, interiors more divided, household goods more numerous. The bed and later the mattress fit into this wider effort to regularize everyday life. The night no longer had to be improvised in the same way. It could be prepared in advance, held in place, and repeated. This repetition matters because it gradually teaches the body a new expectation. What was once a special or selective form of comfort can, across generations, come to feel like the minimum condition for proper rest. That is how historical arrangements become psychological baselines. A child raised on a mattress does not experience it as a late material achievement. The mattress simply feels like where sleep belongs. But history shows that this feeling is new. For most of human existence, sleep did not arrive on a standardized surface. It arrived on whatever human beings could make tolerable enough at the edge of fatigue. That older world did not disappear because the body changed. It disappeared because the environments around the body changed. This is a crucial distinction. The human need for sleep remained ancient and continuous. What changed was the amount of material intervention standing between that need and the earth. Each layer, mat, padding, platform, frame, stuffing, textile, mattress, reduced direct contact with the unpredictability below. Yet every added layer also depended on a more complex world of production, storage, domestic routine, and social stability. A mattress, especially in its modern forms, belongs to a society that can manufacture softness at scale, transport it, sell it, replace it, and treat it as normal household equipment. That is a very distant world from the one in which most of human history unfolded. This is why the mattress should not be treated as the obvious destiny of human sleep. It is one highly developed answer to a very old problem, but only one answer, and an extremely recent one when measured against the lifetime of the species. The long road toward it was paved not only by inventions, but by changing assumptions about what sleep should feel like. Pressure should be reduced. Cleanliness should be easier to maintain. The sleeping body should be lifted, cushioned, and given a dedicated surface separate from the rest of domestic life. None of these assumptions were timeless. They emerged gradually as human environments became capable of sustaining them. That gradual emergence also means that the story cannot be reduced to progress alone. Something was gained, certainly. Softness, consistency, insulation, privacy, and often a greater sense of domestic order. But something older was also being left behind. Sleep was moving farther from the shared ground, farther from the immediate textures of the environment, and often farther from the collective arrangements that had shaped the human night for so long. The mattress completes a separation that began much earlier. It turns the sleeping surface into something almost fully self-contained. The body no longer has to negotiate much with the earth beneath it. The negotiation has already been performed by materials, craft, and industry. And that is why the title still matters even at this late stage of the story. The more complete the modern sleeping system becomes, the easier it is to forget that for almost all of human time, there was no such system at all. There was only the old biological need to sleep and the long human effort to make the ground, or something very close to it, bearable enough for one more night. The mattress sits at the end of that effort, but the ground stands at its beginning, and for far longer than modern memory usually allows. At the end of this long history, the bed can finally be seen in its proper size. It is not trivial, and it is not timeless. It is one of the clearest examples of how human beings gradually turn survival into habit, habit into structure, and structure into something that later generations mistake for nature. For most of our species' existence, sleep did not arrive in a room prepared around a mattress. It arrived on ground-level surfaces shaped as well as possible by local materials, shared warmth, and the immediate demands of night. Then, very slowly, those surfaces began to change. They were softened, layered, lifted, framed, reserved, and eventually standardized. What had once been a direct relationship between body and earth became, over time, a relationship mediated by craft, domestic order, wealth, privacy, and industry. The mattress is the late expression of all those changes. It holds the modern body in a sleep environment that would have been unfamiliar to most humans who ever lived. Yet the point of this history is not to romanticize the ground or to condemn the bed. It is to restore proportion. When we remember that most of human history slept without a bed, we are reminded that many things we now treat as basic are actually recent. That reminder has value because it makes us more careful thinkers. It teaches us not to confuse familiarity with permanence, and not to assume that the present form of life is the form life always had. The same human body that now expects softness, separation, and a stable sleeping surface was shaped across a far longer past in which rest happened under much thinner conditions. That does not mean we should reject comfort. It means comfort should be understood as a historical achievement, not as a timeless human starting point. There is a quiet humility in that realization. The modern world often encourages the feeling that our ordinary routines are natural simply because they surround us from childhood. But history repeatedly shows otherwise. It shows that the ordinary is often the newest layer. The bed is one such layer. It belongs to the recent human effort to control more of the environment, to divide domestic space more precisely, and to reduce the body's direct negotiation with the earth. That effort brought many benefits, but it also made it easier to forget how long human life persisted before those benefits became common. In that forgetting, the species can start to misunderstand itself. We begin to think of human beings as creatures naturally made for soft, private, elevated rest, when in fact, those conditions are the result of very long cultural and material developments. The educational value of this story lies there. It helps us see that civilization is not the same as human nature, and that many comforts are best understood not as biological necessities from the beginning, but as later solutions layered onto ancient bodies. Once we see that clearly, the title opens into something larger than furniture. It becomes a lesson in how easily human memory shrinks. We remember the room and forget the landscape. We remember the mattress and forget the ground. We remember private comfort and forget the shared sleeping world in which children, adults, warmth, fear, and care remained close together for most of the species past. To recover that longer view is not to glorify hardship. It is to become more honest about where we came from, and perhaps that honesty offers a gentler kind of wisdom. It reminds us that human beings have always been more adaptable than the objects around them, and that the body carried sleep across immense stretches of time before the bed ever became ordinary. The bed changed the setting of sleep, but it did not create the sleeping creature. That creature was already old, already vulnerable, already dependent on the night, and already learning, generation after generation, how to rest on a world not yet arranged for comfort. So as the room grows quiet, and the modern sleeper settles into a surface built by a very recent history, one older thought remains beneath it all. If the human body spent almost all of its story learning to sleep close to the earth, what else in our lives now feels ancient only because we have forgotten how new it really is?